They say the deepest wounds are not carved by knives or accidents, but by the very people who should have loved us the most. And if you've ever felt abandoned in the moment you most needed compassion, then you'll understand why this story begins. Not with comfort, but with cruelty. Not with arms wrapped around a grieving daughter, but with laughter sharp enough to slice open an already broken heart. Because when she lost her baby, she thought at least her mother might sit beside her and stroke her hair the way she once did during fevers. But instead she was told that one useless life had finally taken the hint, and that sentence, as venomous as it was, became the seed of a transformation no one in her family ever saw coming. Now pause here, because this is where most viewers expect another tragedy. They think the story will follow the usual arc of suffering, depression, silence, maybe even self-destructs. But what if grief can harden into something else? What if betrayal sharpens instead of dulls? What if the one everyone calls weak learns to play the long game? The answer is hidden in how the human mind reacts to cruelty. Psychologists often talk about post-traumatic growth, the strange phenomenon where people don't just survive hardship, but are reshaped into something more dangerous, more strategic, more resilient. And here we see the earliest spark of that process. A young woman sitting hollow in a hospital bed, realizing that the people she thought she needed had already buried her emotionally, and instead of breaking, she went silent. Silence not as surrender, but as armor. And before we dive into the details, let me ask you something. What would you do if the family that was supposed to protect you laughed at your worst pain? Would you still crave their approval, or would you start quietly planning the moment when every cruel word would come back to destroy them? This is where our story begins, and to keep you watching until the very last frame, know this: the same womb her father said should have closed years ago was the very womb that birthed their downfall. The first night back home should have been a night of mourning, a quiet dinner where grief had room to breathe. But in this family, grief was treated like a disease, something shameful to be hidden away. So instead of a warm silence, she was seated at the table like a ghost among the living. And while her body still ached from loss, her sister Melissa twirled in her chair, gushing about the gown she would wear at her recital. A recital that her parents celebrated as if it were the royal wedding. Her mother praised Melissa for looking angelic. Her father raised his glass with pride. And then their eyes turned toward the one who had just lost her child, those eyes narrowing, calculating, warning her not to ruin tomorrow's performance by looking pathetic. This wasn't a family meal. It was a stage where roles were enforced. Melissa, the shining star, the parents the proud directors, and her the unwanted understudy whose existence only embarrassed them. And here's where commentary matters, because what we see is not just cruelty. It is narcissistic family dynamics in full bloom. Psychologists often describe the scapegoat role, where one child absorbs all the blame and ridicule, so the favored child can remain untarnished. And Melissa's smirk when she stabbed her fork into her chicken and mocked her sister's failure at motherhood wasn't just a cruel remark. It was the confirmation of years of conditioning, the reinforcement that in this family one daughter was adored and the other existed to be diminished. Yet beneath the silence of the scapegoat, something was changing. Grief had been stripped of its tears and replaced with something darker. A new seed forming not of weakness, but of rage, and rage, when properly directed, can become a blueprint for power. So she swallowed their poison that night, not because she believed it, but because she was already sketching the outlines of their downfall. She realized that silence unsettled them more than tears ever could, because for the first time at that dinner table, while laughter echoed around her, she felt the faintest smile tugging at her lips. A silent promise to herself that one day the same voices mocking her would choke on their own pride. And in that moment, the transformation from victim to strategist quietly began. The next morning, the house buzzed with excitement. Melissa standing in the living room in her glittering gown, curls bouncing as if she were auditioning for a crown rather than a school recital. Their mother circling her like a stylist fixing straps and smoothing fabric, while their father clapped like a proud coach watching his star player. And in the doorway stood the sister they'd buried emotionally, still in wrinkled pajamas, still aching from the loss no one dared to acknowledge. But once again invisible, unnoticed, unworthy of even a glance. And here is where the cruelty sharpened, because Melissa caught her eye in the mirror and smirked, warning her not to cry during the recital because her depressing face would ruin the photos. And instead of correcting her, their mother laughed and agreed, telling her not to sit in the front where people might wonder why she looked like death. And their father added his final threat, a reminder that if she dared to make the day about herself, he would ensure she regretted it. Now, to any outsider, this might seem like overprotective parents focused on their younger daughter's big moment, but the subtext runs much deeper, because narcissistic families thrive on image management, on controlling what outsiders see, and grief, especially female grief, is often treated as something shameful, an inconvenience that threatens the family's curated image of success. And so her pain was not just dismissed, it was criminalized, turned into a potential embarrassment they had to suppress. And yet, while they believed they had silenced her, they missed the most dangerous shift of all. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't even defend herself. She just nodded and walked away. And in that silence lay the blueprint of her revenge. Because silence to them meant weakness, but in reality, it was camouflage. It was the art of hiding in plain sight. And upstairs she opened the drawer where she had hidden scraps of their Cruelty screenshots of texts where her mother called her a burden, a recording of her father calling her a waste of space, videos of Melissa mocking her for failing at everything. And while once she had kept these as reminders that she wasn't imagining their abuse, now she saw them as something far more powerful, not just proof but ammunition. Because the truth is, abusers rarely believe their victims will ever fight back. They confuse quiet endurance with permanent defeat. And in that fatal miscalculation, she found her opportunity. Because she wasn't planning to interrupt Melissa's recital with tears. She was planning to wait until the performance was over, until the applause had filled the air, until her parents felt invincible. And then she would begin planting the first seeds of their downfall. The recital hall glowed with anticipation, families filling the rows, children chattering, parents adjusting cameras, and in the back corner she slipped quietly into her seat, unnoticed, deliberately small, because invisibility had always been her assigned role. Yet she wasn't invisible to herself anymore. She was watching, cataloging, studying every smile and every gesture like a detective at a crime scene. Her eyes scanning not the stage, but the faces of those who believed themselves untouchable. And when the lights dimmed and Melissa walked onto the stage in her glittering dress, the applause thundered. Her father leaning forward with a grin stretched wide, her mother clutching her pearls as though their daughter were royalty. The picture-perfect image of a proud family supporting their shining star. But in that applause lay a lie, a performance, layered on top of another performance. And as she watched Melissa spin across the stage, she saw not grace, but arrogance. Not beauty, but cruelty dressed in satin. The same cruelty that had laughed at her loss and dismissed her pain. And here's where analysis matters. Because what we are witnessing is the mask of narcissistic families in public. Psychologists often call it the golden child performance, where the favored child becomes the proof of parental success, while the scapegoat is hidden, erased, and stripped of recognition. And if you think this is only a story about one family, think again. Because how many people do you know who curate their lives for outsiders while rotting inside with secrets? The lesson here is that image is often weaponized. And in this case, the recital wasn't just about music. It was about power, about reinforcing to everyone in the room that Melissa was radiant and her sister was irrelevant. Yet as Melissa bowed and the applause shook the room, Her eyes flicking to find her sister in the crowd, she made one mistake. She looked for validation from the very person she had mocked, expecting to see defeat, and instead she saw stillness. Calm, a face with no cracks, and that unsettled her more than any outburst could have. Because abusers feed on visible pain, and when they no longer see it, they begin to sense a threat they cannot name. After the performance, families crowded. With flowers, neighbors complimented Melissa's grace. Her parents basked in every word as if the praise were their own. And then came the dagger disguised as small talk. Her mother smiling proudly before turning to the sister and saying with a dismissive flick of the eyes, "Well, you know, some branches just rot." Her father chuckling about good roots growing strong, Melissa laughing that some branches shouldn't even exist. And if you think those words were just cruel metaphors, think again. They were declarations of hierarchy, public reminders of who mattered and who did not. Yet what they didn't realize was that the branch they called rotten was already the axe, silently sharpening for the moment it would cut down the entire tree. That night, while champagne glasses clinked and Melissa basked in the glow of her applause, while neighbors praised her as if she were destined for greatness, the sister who had been cast as invisible slipped quietly away because silence had become her disguise and patience her most dangerous weapon. And as laughter carried down the hallway, she pushed open the door to her father's office, the one room he believed untouchable, his private sanctuary where he stored papers and contracts with the arrogance of a man, convinced no one else in the house had the intelligence to understand them. But she had watched him before, memorizing the way he slipped papers into a drawer, smirking at her as if she would never notice, and now, standing in the dim light, she entered the code to that drawer from memory, the same code he thought only he knew. And when the lock clicked open, she felt a shift inside her body, the emptiness of grief replaced with the adrenaline of discovery. Because inside were not harmless contracts, but evidence. Tangible proof of the rot that her family had worked so hard to cover, fraudulent transfers, accounts in fake names, signatures forged in her mother's hand, even Melissa's name tied to funds she probably had no idea were illegal. And here's where the analysis bites hard, because abusers often build their cruelty onto pillars: power inside the family and reputation outside of it. And reputation almost always rests on deception, on building an image so flawless that no one would ever suspect corruption. And as she held those papers in her trembling hands, she realized that what she had stumbled upon was more than validation. It was leverage, the kind of leverage that could collapse everything they had built. This was no longer about whispered insults at the dinner table or cruel laughter over her grief. This was about dismantling the very foundation of their pride. And here's the irony worth noting: while her father told her womb should have closed years ago, it was that same womb that gave her clarity to understand loss. And with loss came fearlessness, because what else could they take from her now? And that fearlessness made her dangerous, so she tucked the papers back with precision, every page aligned as if untouched, every detail preserved, because revenge is not impulsive. Revenge is patient. It is the art of waiting until the exact moment when exposure will be most devastating. And as she closed the drawer softly and stepped out into the hallway, she heard the muffled sound of her family's laughter, still echoing from the living room. And instead of flinching, she smiled, because they still believed she was broken, and broken people are underestimated. But underestimated people are the ones who learn to rewrite the rules of the game. The following evening at dinner, the air carried the same rhythm of arrogance. Her mother raising a glass to Melissa's brilliance, her father leaning back smugly, Melissa basking in the glow of compliments as though she were the sun itself. And then came the moment of ritual cruelty, Melissa turning to her sister with a smirk, taunting her with the words, "Don't be jealous. Some of us were just born to shine." And for the first time, something shifted, not in her but in them. Because she didn't look down. She didn't wince. She didn't retreat. Instead, she smiled a small, deliberate smile, and for a flicker of a second Melissa's laughter faltered, her father's face hardened, and her mother's polished confidence cracked at the edges. Because silence had always been the signal of defeat, but a smile suggested something else, something they couldn't place, and that uncertainty rattled them more than any argument ever had. Now pause here for analysis, because what's happening is subtle but crucial. In abusive systems, the target is expected to play their role, to absorb insults quietly or collapse under them. But when the victim suddenly breaks the script, when they stop reacting as expected, the entire balance of control begins to shake. And this is what she understood instinctively. That by smiling at the right moment, she could inject doubt into the one thing her family relied on: predictability. And doubt is poison to people who build their identities on control. So when her father slammed his hand against the table and demanded to know what she was smiling about, she met his gaze and said softly, just thinking, "Some crowns are heavier than they look." A line delivered so calmly it hung heavier than any insult they had thrown her way. And in that instant, the atmosphere at the table changed. Not permanently. Not yet. But like a tiny crack in glass, invisible to most, inevitable to those who know how fractures spread. And while they brushed it off with scoffs and another pour of wine, she knew that seed of unease had been planted. And from that night forward, she no longer needed to shout. She no longer needed to fight for their attention. She only needed to play her part quietly, obediently, cooking dinner, folding laundry, nodding when insults came, letting them believe she was docile again. Because complacency makes predators careless, and she was no longer prey. She was a strategist waiting for the perfect stage. And in the meantime, she had already begun copying every document. She had found every fraudulent transfer, every forged signature, every link that tied her parents' arrogance to their inevitable downfall. And as she worked quietly behind their backs, she realized something powerful. Revenge wasn't about destroying them in the heat of anger. It was about dismantling them brick by brick, in public, where the world could see that the family who laughed at her grief had been living on lies all along. Over the following weeks, the house returned to its old rhythm. Or at least that's what her family believed, because cruelty has a way of becoming routine. Like background noise, no one bothers to question, and so they laughed louder, mocked, sharper, and carried themselves with the smugness of people convinced the hierarchy would never shift. But she had already changed the game. She had learned the art of invisibility not as survival, but as strategy, cooking meals when asked, folding laundry without protest, nodding to their insults as if she were still the broken one, and while she was gathering, copying, building a case from the shadows, scanning bank records, preserving forged signatures, documenting every piece of evidence that linked their wealth and Melissa's scholarship to crimes they thought too sophisticated for anyone to uncover. And here's the analytical truth worth pausing on. Revenge that succeeds is rarely impulsive. It is constructed with the patience of an architect. Because the goal isn't just to inflict pain, but to dismantle the very foundations of power. To expose lies not in whispers, but in the blinding light of public scrutiny. And she understood that if she struck too early, they would spin a story, dismiss her as unstable, play the victims of their own daughter's bitterness. But if she waited for the moment when their pride was at its peak, when the room was filled with neighbors, friends, church members, people who had witnessed them mock her for years, then the truth would land like an earthquake, impossible to ignore, undeniable to deny. And so she lived two lives in those weeks. Outwardly, the obedient daughter with lowered eyes and quiet hands. Inwardly, the strategist filing every piece of evidence into neat order, rehearsing the moment in her mind when the facade would crumble. And every smile her parents threw at Melissa became fuel. Every insult aimed at her was another brick in the case she was building. Because cruelty may wound, but arrogance blinds. And her family was too arrogant to notice the silence of the girl. They had underestimated, too blind to see that the one they called worthless was already holding the key to their ruin. And so, when the night of Melissa's celebration dinner arrived, with the house glittering in lights and champagne glasses clinking under the chandelier, she knew the stage had finally been set. And this time, it wouldn't be Melissa who shone under the spotlight, it would be the truth. The night of Melissa's celebration dinner unfolded like a coronation. The house glittering with golden light as neighbors, friends, and church members filled the rooms. Champagne glasses clinked, polished laughter rose into the chandelier glow. And at the center of it all stood Melissa, radiant in her gown, cheeks flushed with the pride of being chosen, the scholarship pinned on her like a medal of honor. And her parents paraded around her as though she were proof of their legacy, the living embodiment of their success. Every handshake and compliment feeding their delusion that they had raised perfection. While in the corner she stood quietly, the invisible one, the sister dismissed as fragile, broken, irrelevant. But tonight she wasn't invisible to herself. Tonight she was the architect who had designed every detail of what was about to unfold. And as her father raised his glass with smug certainty, declaring Melissa the fruit of good roots unlike rotten branches that should have been cut long ago, the room chuckled in safe complicity, their laughter spilling like champagne. But she didn't flinch. She stepped forward calmly, a folder in her hands. And for the first time in years, her voice cut through the noise, steady and unshaking. Actually, I have something to add to the toast. And in that instant, the entire room shifted. Conversation stilled. Glasses hovered mid-air. Her parents smirked, ready to dismiss her. Melissa rolled her eyes, waiting for humiliation. But what came next wasn't humiliation, it was exposure. Because with deliberate precision, she opened the folder and laid the papers across the table for all to see. Bank transfers under false names, forged contracts with her mother's signature, Melissa's scholarship money traced to fraudulent accounts. And here's where the analysis matters. Because in psychology, there's a term called cognitive dissonance. The discomfort people feel when the truth violently collides with the image they've believed. And that's exactly what swept across the room, whispers cutting sharp through the silence. Neighbors leaning in, eyes widening at government seals, Melissa's name on accounts, her parents' signatures, the facade cracking in real time, and her father lunged red-faced, demanding to know where she got the papers. Her mother's polished mask slipping into trembling denial, Melissa sputtering for her parents to fix it. But before they could weave another lie, the unmistakable wail of sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights flashing through the windows like judgment, and gasps rippled through the crowd as the knock on the door came hard and final. Officers stepping inside with voices calm and authoritative, announcing warrants for fraud, forgery, and money laundering. And at that moment, the family that mocked her grief was dragged from their own celebration in handcuffs. Their empire of lies collapsing under the weight of evidence they had once thought invisible. But the most striking image wasn't their downfall. It was her standing silently in the corner, no longer broken, no longer erased, but finally seen, not through screams or tears, but through the quiet power of truth. The sound of shattered glass echoed through the room as someone dropped their champagne in shock. A sound that felt almost symbolic, the delicate illusion of perfection breaking into jagged pieces on the floor. And as the officers read the charges, fraud, money laundering, forgery, the once proud parents shouted and clawed in desperation, their voices rising in shrill protests that only revealed more guilt. The mother's mascara streaking as she screamed that her daughter had always been worthless. The father raging that she was nothing, even as steel cuffs closed around his wrists. But the louder they screamed, the clearer the truth became to everyone watching. Because neighbors and church friends weren't hearing the words of victims. They were hearing the unraveling of liars, manipulators, and hypocrites, and Melissa, the golden child, sat crumpled on the couch, her perfect gown wrinkled, her hands trembling as she begged for someone to say it wasn't real, her voice breaking as she realized her scholarship, her shining identity, had been paid for by corruption. And what mattered most in that moment wasn't their downfall, but the shift in the room. The faces of people who had once pitied her or whispered about her weakness now staring with something different: shock, yes, but also recognition, respect, even a kind of fear. Because it was dawning on them that the branch they had all believed rotten was the one strong enough to fell, the tree. And here's the critical insight. Communities thrive on narratives. And once a narrative collapses, it collapses fast. For years, these people had accepted the performance of a perfect family, with one broken daughter. But now the script was inverted. The perfect family revealed as fraudulent, the broken daughter revealed as the truth teller. And as the police led her parents out in handcuffs with neighbors whispering in disbelief, she didn't need to shout her victory. She didn't need to gloat or even smile, because power had already shifted. The laughter that once cut into her had turned against them. And while her parents cursed her name from the back of the police car, and Melissa sobbed into her manicured hands, she stood on the porch calm, steady, almost serene, finally seen not as weak, not as fragile, but as someone who had survived the worst and turned survival into a weapon. And in that silence, the community realized something they should have known all along. The quietest person in the room is often the one writing the ending. In the days that followed the arrests, the house that once buzzed with arrogant laughter became a hollow shell, silence echoing in rooms that had been staged for performance rather than love. And outside those walls, the scandal spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered not about Melissa's grace, but about the handcuffs. Church members who once praised her parents now avoided their names. Friends who had once accepted invitations to parties spoke in low voices about fraud and shame. And here lies the irony worth dissecting. Abusers spend their lives terrified of embarrassment, terrified of cracks in their public mask. But in the end, their own arrogance is what amplifies the collapse. Because the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. And while her parents sat behind cold bars waiting for their lawyers, she walked through the same streets that had once carried gossip about her. Supposed weakness now met with hesitant nods, awkward respect, even cautious admiration, because people didn't know how to categorize her anymore. Was she the victim, the survivor, or the executioner? And the truth was she had become all three. And for the first time in years, she felt something close to power. Not the toxic power her family flaunted, but the quiet kind, the kind built on survival and truth. Yet this is where commentary matters most, because power alone doesn't heal. And revenge, as satisfying as it might appear, is never the same as closure. The scars they left on her body and mind weren't erased by their downfall. They were only reframed. And she knew that moving forward, she had to decide who she wanted to be without them. Was she going to become consumed by the very darkness that drove her to act? Or was she going to use this moment to rebuild, to define herself not by what she had lost, but by what she had created out of that loss? And in the quiet of her room, where grief once hollowed her, she began sketching the outlines of a different life. One where her silence was no longer a cage, but a canvas. Where her survival wasn't just about revenge, but about reclaiming her own story. Because families can strip you of dignity, of recognition, even of identity. But once you learn they cannot strip you of truth, you hold the only weapon that truly matters. And she had proven that the truth, once revealed, is louder than any insult, sharper than any laugh, and impossible to bury. In the weeks after the scandal, When the adrenaline faded and the sirens became memory, she began to feel the weight of silence in a new way, not as a weapon, not as a shield, but as a mirror reflecting back the reality that even in victory, grief does not vanish. Because revenge is a fire that burns brightly but leaves behind smoke that lingers in the lungs. And though her parents' empire had collapsed and Melissa's golden crown had turned to ash, the small life she had lost in that hospital room remained gone, the hollow ache in her body still real, the absence still echoing. And this is where the story resists the easy fairy tale ending, because we often imagine justice as the closing of a wound. Yet psychologists remind us that revenge offers satisfaction, but not resolution. It rebalances power, but cannot restore what was taken. And she knew that. She felt that. Sitting at her desk at night staring at the pile of documents she had once clutched like weapons, realizing they were no longer needed, their power spent, their role complete. And for the first time she allowed herself to cry, not tears of weakness, but tears of release. Because survival had required her to hold her grief hostage, to bury it beneath strategy. But now, with her family stripped of control, she finally had the safety to feel what had been denied to her. And here lies the deeper commentary: grief delayed is grief magnified. When a person is not allowed to mourn openly, the sorrow hardens into something sharper. But when space is finally carved out, when the cruelty is gone, mourning can take its natural course. And that night she lit a candle on her windowsill, not for her parents, not for her sister, but for the child she never held, whispering a promise that their short existence had not been in vain, because it was that loss, weaponized by cruelty, that birthed the strength to dismantle everything false. And from that truth she began to imagine a new identity. Not as the scapegoat her parents had cast her as, not as the avenger who brought them down, but as someone who could exist outside of them entirely. Her own story no longer bound to their corruption, her own name no longer echoing against their insults. And in that fragile moment of self-recognition, she understood something vital. Freedom is not only the absence of chains, it is the presence of a life you choose to build for yourself. As the months unfolded and the scandal settled into history, she found herself at a crossroads. Because revenge had given her clarity, justice had given her dignity, but neither had given her direction. And now she had to answer the question that every survivor eventually faces: who am I when the fight is over? And what does it mean to live when your identity has been shaped by pain? And at first the silence felt disorienting. No more insults to brace against, no more performances to endure, no more daily reminders of her supposed worthlessness. And without those external battles, her own inner voice grew louder, sometimes whispering doubts, sometimes urging her toward freedom. And she realized that she had spent so long being defined in opposition, opposite of her sister, opposite of her parents, opposite of their image, that she had never had the chance to define herself on her own terms. And here lies the insight worth exploring. Psychologists call this stage post-traumatic redefinition, the process where survivors must move from existing as reactors to existing as creators. And it is often the hardest stage because pain at least gives focus, but freedom gives uncertainty. So she began experimenting with small choices, picking up sketching again, applying for jobs without asking permission, cooking meals only for herself, decisions so ordinary they felt radical, because for the first time they weren't filtered through her family's judgment. And though the world still whispered about the scandal, though Melissa's name appeared in news reports about investigations, though her parents' trials dragged on, she no longer flinched, because their story was no longer hers. Their downfall was already sealed, and she had no need to keep revisiting it. And as she walked through the city one afternoon, sunlight warm on her skin, she caught her reflection in a shop window and saw not the broken girl from the hospital, not the scapegoat from the dinner table, but a woman carrying both scars and strength. And in that fleeting reflection, she finally recognized herself, not as a victim, not as an avenger, but simply as someone still alive, and alive was enough. Because from there she could build. Healing does not come in a straight line. And she discovered this when some mornings she woke with a lightness she had never known, while other mornings she was ambushed by memories. Her mother's laugh still echoing, her father's words still burning, Melissa's smirk still taunting. Because trauma does not disappear simply because justice has been served. It lingers like smoke even after the fire has been put out. And the real task was not to eliminate the smoke, but to learn how to breathe through it. And in time she began to understand that reconciliation wasn't about forgiving her family, because forgiveness in this case would have been another cage. It was about forgiving herself for the silence she once mistook for weakness, for the years she believed she truly was less, for the tears she held back to avoid their ridicule. And this is where commentary becomes essential, because survivors are often told that strength means moving on, but true strength sometimes means admitting that rage remains, that scars remain, that grief remains, and instead of trying to bury those feelings, she chose to place them beside her resilience, to accept that the same rage that once scared her was also the rage that gave her courage, that the same grief that hollowed her was also the grief that sharpened her clarity, and that the silence that once felt imposed had become the silence she wielded with intention. So reconciliation, for her, meant not choosing between pain and power, but holding both in her hands without shame. And slowly she began to see her story not as a tragedy alone, not as revenge alone, but as a continuum, a journey where survival, anger, truth, and hope all had their place. And it was in this acceptance that she found a deeper form of freedom. Not just the absence of her family's control, not just the thrill of their downfall, but the quiet realization that she had the right to exist fully, rage and all, resilience and all, without apology. With time she realized survival alone was not enough, that living only for herself, while necessary, left something unfinished, because silence had once been forced upon her, but now she had a choice, and she chose not to let her voice remain buried. So she began writing pieces of her story, not the full revenge, not the sensational details of police cars and handcuffs, but fragments of what it felt like to be invisible at a dinner table, fragments of what it meant to lose a child and be mocked instead of held, fragments of what it meant to endure cruelty, disguised as family love. And at first the words were only for her, scrawled in notebooks, whispered in journal entries, but slowly they became something larger. Posts on anonymous forums where strangers read and sent me to, small conversations with coworkers who quietly admitted their own families had buried them in silence. And it was in those exchanges that she discovered the true opposite of isolation was not attention, but recognition, the simple acknowledgement that someone else had lived a version of the same story. And here's where the analysis is vital. Trauma festers in secrecy, but begins to loosen its grip the moment it is spoken, because naming an experience strips it of its power to masquerade as personal failure. And in telling fragments of her story, she wasn't just freeing herself. She was offering a mirror to others who thought their pain was unspeakable. And in their gratitude, she found a purpose that revenge had never given her, because revenge satisfied the hunger for justice, but connection nourished the hunger for meaning. And slowly she realized she had shifted roles entirely, from scapegoat to survivor, from survivor to strategist, and now from strategist to witness. A person who could stand in the wreckage of her own past and say to others, your pain is real, your story matters, and silence does not have to be the end of it. And for the first time, she understood that maybe her greatest act of defiance wasn't just destroying the false legacy of her family, but building something true in its place. A life where her scars spoke not of shame, but of proof. Proof that cruelty can be dismantled. Proof that silence can become voice. Proof that survival can grow into something that helps others rise. In the end, her story was never just about revenge. Though that moment of exposure had been sharp and unforgettable, it was about what came after the slow realization that strength is not the absence of pain, but the ability to build even while carrying it. That survival is not about erasing scars, but about wearing them as proof of endurance. And most importantly, that silence, once a cage, had become her choice. No longer imposed by cruelty, but wielded as power. And when she lit candles for the child she lost, she knew grief would never leave entirely. But grief no longer defined her. And when people whispered about her family's downfall, she no longer flinched, because their story had finally detached from hers. And when strangers online or in quiet conversations admitted their own burdens, she knew she had transformed something ugly into something useful. And here's the truth worth leaving with you: the people who laugh at your wounds believe they are burying you. But what they never realize is that sometimes they are planting you. And seeds planted in cruelty can grow into forests strong enough to swallow the lies that tried to erase them. And if you carry scars of your own, if you've ever been mocked in your darkest moment, remember this: you don't need their validation to prove your worth. You only need your truth, because truth, once revealed, is louder than any insult, sharper than any laugh, and impossible to bury. And that is why her story is not a tragedy, but a rebirth. The moment when a broken daughter turned her silence into the blade that cut down a legacy built on cruelty, and then used that same silence to grow something no one could ever take away again. This story reminds us that cruelty thrives in silence. But silence does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is survival. And sometimes it becomes the sharpest form of justice. And while revenge can expose hypocrisy, it is the choice to rebuild, to speak, and to live on your own terms that transforms pain into power.